Hare Krishna, good morning dear devotees from Sridham Mayapur. My name is Madhavananda Das, and these are our morning adventures in Srimad Bhagavatam. So today, we're going to speak something further about what happened in Mathura when Krishna stayed and Nanda Maharaj returned to Vrindavan. And today we have a very, very esoteric subject in front of us, how Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that Krishna actually simultaneously stayed in Mathura and also at the same time returned to Vrindavan with Nanda Maharaj. Very esoteric and very integral and very important for our discussion about the meeting in Kurukshetra, of which this is part 18. So we'll begin with a few prayers. Gora Graganya Gana Gotra Goloruharam Goranga Guritama Gopyada Kolpa Briksham Gopala Gada Ratidam Yati Singha Gora Govinda Deshi Kavaram Satatam Namami Narayanam Namaskrityam Nadamschaiva Narotamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayat Vedi Ramayanesh Chaiva Purane Bhadate Tata Adhavante Chamadyecha Hari Sarvatra Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langayate Girim Yet Kripa Tamaham Vande Shri Gurum Dinataranam Paramananda Madhavam Paramananda He Madhava Padunga Luchi Makaranda Se Makaranda Panakori Anande Bolo Hari Hari Harinka Name Vandavela Parikoribe Chakadola Se Chakadolanka Paraye Manamo Rahu Nirantare Manamo Nirantare Rahu Ha Krishna Boli Jiva Jao Ha Krishna Boli Jao Jiva Moteu Dada Radha Dava Moteu Dada Radha Dava Moteu Dada Radha Dava Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're continuing our discussion. This is part 12 of what happened in Mathura. How Krishna stayed in Mathura we'll discuss today and simultaneously returned to Vrindavan with Nanda Maharaj. So in our previous session, we spoke something about what was happening and how Nanda Maharaj spent the entire day until finally evening crying and getting in the chariot and getting off the chariot and running to Krishna and falling unconscious until finally, at the end of the day, Krishna left Nanda Maharaj left Mathura. And we heard from Gopal Champu how Nanda Maharaj sent messengers ahead of him to speak with Upananda and his other older brothers and telling them that there is some intolerable news. And Upananda and the others, they thought, how is this possible? What can be intolerable? The most wonderful news is that Krishna's returning, and they were expecting that. So we also heard in the previous session how Krishna and Balaram, they spoke to Nanda and Yashoda, to Nanda Maharaj, and they addressed him as Pitta Yuvabhyam Snigdabhyam. They said that you are our father. And he says, Yuvabhyam, that you, the two of you, meaning you and Mother Yashoda. Snigdabhyam poshito lolito, you thoroughly, brisham, with great affection, you maintained us. Poshita. And our acharyas described that Krishna and Balaram, in this way, they're saying, we don't believe all these rumors and this idea that we're supposed to be the sons of Vasudeva. You're our real father and mother. And in 3 verses, they speak like this to Nanda Maharaj, that you're our real father. And then Krishna finally, he tells Nanda Maharaj, Yata yuyam brajam tata vayam cha snehadukitam. My dear father, all of you, please return now to Vrindavan. And we're going to come and see you. Remember, I promised Ayashya. And then in our last session we heard, It yuktasto parisvadya nanda pranaya vivala parayam ashubir netre saha gopar brajam yayo. How Nanda Maharaj became completely overwhelmed. And parisvadya, he embraced again and again Krishna and Balaram. And he was crying. Pranaya vivalo, with tears of love. He was completely overwhelmed. And he was crying and crying. And then it said that Saha Gopai Brajam Yayo, along with the cowherd boys and his younger brothers who had accompanied him to Mathura, Nanda Maharaj returned to Vrindavan. So I'd like to look at some of the purports from our acharyas on this important verse, how Nanda Maharaj returned to Vrindavan. I hope we can finish it in this session. First of all, Jiva Goswami, in his commentaries, Laghu Vaishnav Toshini, he can't control himself. And he writes a verse. And the verse is actually not really commenting upon the pastime. Rather, the verse is an explosion of Jiva Goswami's personal feelings about the whole matter. Aho bhagavato nami balatsarva pravartanam prahinotya swadsunepi Sri Nandadhin api braje tvam brajeshwari sochami tvam cha Vrindavaneshwari Krishnam vinagatesh esho ha ha jivishyata katam. Jiva Goswami says that I offer my pranams to Krishna, who arranged everything. Through, he says, Aho Bhagavato Nami Bhalat Sava Pravartanam. He did it through the power of Bhagavan. And as we spoke in some previous sessions, that Jiva Goswami says that killing the demons and things, that's not such a big thing. Dharma samstarpanartaya, establishing a religion, that's not such a big thing. But what's an astonishing thing is how it was possible that Krishna, he had the power to send Nanda Maharaj back to Vrindavan. That's inconceivable. So again here Jiva Goswami is citing that. How it's possible. Sonuse pi nandinana bibraje, to send Nanda Maharaj back to Vrindavan without Krishna. And then Jiva Goswami, unable to control himself, he says, Tvam brajeshri sochami tvam cha Vrindavaneshri. He begins to lament, first of all, for Brajeshwari Yashoda, and then for Vrindavaneshri Radha. And he says, Sochami, I'm lamenting for you. He says, Krishnam Vina, without Krishna, ha ha jivishyata katam. How are you going to maintain your lives? It's not just a philosophical question, but in the verse which Jiva Goswami composed in his commentary, generally he doesn't give shlokas, but sometimes there's some special reason he does. And in this case, it's a special reason. And he uses a phrase, ha ha. Ha means he's lamenting like anything. How is it possible? How are you going to live without Krishna? Jiva Goswami, he's no longer commenting like an impartial observer or like a scholar. But he's so absorbed in the situation. Now it's become personal for him. And he's exploding. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in his Sartha Darshini gives a very long commentary on this verse, and I'd like to go through it with the devotees. He says some very, very profound and some very, very esoteric things. He says that the verse, we're speaking about text 25 of chapter 45 of the 10th canto. He says, by the phrase pranaya vivala, it means that Nanda Maharaj, although he was almost unconscious due to separation from Krishna, somehow he returned to Vrindavan. And at that time, Krishna and Balaram, the verse is indicating, went to the house of Vasudeva, and there they were happy. They lived in a happy way. And Vishwanath says, this is not a very nice thing to say. He says, Rasik devotees, they're not going to appreciate it. How is the Bhagavatam saying this? Those Rasik devotees, they can't tolerate even the slightest decrease in ecstatic love. And when they hear about Krishna staying away from Vrindavan and Krishna being happy there, they can't tolerate this. They'll object. And Vishwanath says, okay, we're going to approach this subject. And later on in our discussion, he says, we're going to reconcile their objections with a very, he calls a very new, a very novel interpretation. And he says, may this be accepted by those who appreciate it. Now he says, first of all, it's very clear that verses 21 to 25, the literal meaning is not favorable to prem. These texts describe how Krishna and Balaram are saying, Father, we love you, everything's okay, but we're going to stay here, and you have to return to Vrindavan. But don't worry, we have some nice gifts. In text 24 it said, we're sending some nice presents to everybody there in Vrindavan. We'll hear more about that from Brihad Bhagavatamrita a little later. And Vishwanath says, in these explanations, prem's not even established because there's separation of Nanda and Krishna. So how can you say there's prema? Prema indicates that there's always a connection between the lover and the beloved. How can there be separation from Krishna and Nanda Maharaj, from Krishna and the Brijbasis? Now he says, you may say, well, Krishna is Bhagavan. That's what the Hare Krishna devotees always say. Anyway, Prabhu, it's a pastime. And Krishna's God, he can do anything. Vishwanath says, that's not very satisfying. How is it possible that Krishna could abandon his father and stay in Mathura? How could Nanda Maharaj abandon Krishna and go back to Vrindavan alone? How could Nanda Maharaj give up Krishna? Krishna's millions of times more dear to him than his own life. You may say, as we cited in a previous discussion from Gopal Champu, that Krishna told his father, Father, we have something like 100 quadrillion calves. Never mind the big cows, just the calves, the small cows. How are they going to all fit in Mathura? There's not going to be enough grass or parks for them to eat. So, Father, if you really love me, you should go back and take care of the cows. Is that satisfying? Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, don't come and try to tell me that. Don't try to tell me that Nanda Maharaj is saying, okay, we have to take care of the cows, so I'm going to go back. Krishna is millions of times more dear to him than his own life. And what to speak of the cows of Vrindavan? So why didn't Nanda Maharaj just decide, forget it, I'm not going back, I'm going to stay here. You don't want me to be in Mathura, okay? I'm going to stay on the outskirts. Vishwanath raises that question. And then he goes on, he says, the reasons that these verses speak about Krishna and Balaram staying in Mathura, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, these are just weak. These are not good reasons. They're only meant to pacify Nanda Maharaj. And he says that even Krishna and Balaram, they weren't convinced of what they said. They just said it, but they didn't really mean it. That you should go back to Vrindavan and we're going to stay here and be happy. And he says that after all, the 10th canto only describes that Balaram returned to Vrindavan and not Krishna. Someone may say this. Chapter 65 of the 10th canto describes Balaram returning to Vrindavan from Dwarka and how he danced with his gopis. That's a long topic. And Krishna never returned, according to the Bhagavatam. But Vishnu says, wait a minute. First of all, in the Padma Purana, in the Uttarakhanda, it says that Krishna, after he killed all the demons up to Dantavakra, he found himself then in Mathura, and he said, I'm going to slip away. And the Padma Purana says that he returned to Vrindavan. And then he says there's also some evidence in the Bhagavatam, in the first canto, chapter 11, where the residents of Dwarka are speaking to Krishna. Yarhayam bujajak shapasarabo bhavan kurum madun vata sura didikshaya tatrabda koti pratimil kshano bhaved. My dear Lord, your ambuksha, your lotus-eyed, they said that bo bhavan kurum madun, whenever you go away to Mathura, to Vrindavan, or Hastinapur, to meet your friends and relatives, every moment seems like koti pratimukshano bhavet. It seems like millions of years. These are the residents of Dwarka saying that whenever you go back to meet the residents of Vrindavan or Mathura, wait a minute. Vishnu says this is very significant. Our acharyas are so perceptive. When they read the Bhagavatam, they read in such a fine way. Prati shloki, prati akshari, none of the koi. Every verse, every half a verse, every word has unlimited purport in the Bhagavatam. So he says, but these references, they don't clearly show the presence of the prema, the love of Vrindavan and Krishna and Balaram. And he says we should consider what was stated previously in the 39th chapter, a verse that we spoke quite a bit about, where Krishna said, Ayasya. He told the gopis of Vrindavan, the Brajbasis there, that I'm going to return. He sent a messenger. And the word used, it said, Ayash, Krishna said, Ayasya iti dochakai. And Vishwanath points out an interesting thing here. That actually the word dochakai, although generally it's considered to be singular, he says actually the word dotyakai is plural, which means that Krishna is going to send many messengers. Or Vishnu says that by saying dotyakai in the grammar, that Krishna could mean he's going to send one messenger who's going to give the same messages over and over again, more messages. So Vishwanath says that Krishna was used in this verse, he's saying swapremai. The verse describes santavyam asa sapremai. With great love, Krishna is saying indirectly to the gopis, oh gopis, I'm leaving you today only because the Kamsas invited us to the Dana Yajna. It's a very difficult thing to refuse. He's the king, we should be respectful. It's not by my desire. And then after seeing this Dana Yajna, I'm definitely going to return the next day. And maybe if some other work comes up, then I'll stay another day, but the day after that, I'm definitely going to return. Vishwanath says, if this is what really Krishna was thinking, then it can be said supremai, filled with love. But if it's not what Krishna really meant, if Krishna really was thinking, I'm going to have to stay, I got to do this vinashaya to duskritam, dharma samstapanaya, I got to speak Bhagavad Gita, I have to kill a whole lot of demons, I got to go to the office, there's a lot of important things to do, I'm not going to be able to return to Vrindavan for some time. So if that's really what Krishna was saying, then this is deceitful. This is a lie. How is it that the Bhagavatam is saying sapremar, with love? Krishna was speaking. It's not with love. And Vishwanath says that, okay, then you may think that Krishna said this just to bewilder the gopis, just to trick them. And he gives an example when in the same 25th, chapter of the Bhagavatam, when this 45th chapter of the Bhagavatam, when Krishna speaks to Vasudeva and Devaki, he told them, he spoke in such a way, you're our parents, we can't live without you in Mathura. And Vishwanath says he was just doing that. He was being tricky. He didn't really mean that. So someone may say that when Krishna said Ayasya, the supreme Ayasya, that with great love he promised, I'm going to return, that it was just like his words to Devaki and Vasudeva. He didn't really mean it. He was just saying something. In reality, in his heart, Krishna had more love for Nanda Maharaja and Mother Yashoda, our acharyas say. So when he's speaking like this to Vasudeva and Devaki, it wasn't really what he meant. So Vishnu says maybe Krishna's words to the gopis are similar. But then why does Shukadev use the word supremi? With love. Now we can understand if Krishna returned to Braj the day after killing Kamsa, and he neglected all of his other duties like killing Jarasandha and all these, then we can understand that Krishna's really concerned about the love of the gopis. But the fact that Krishna stayed, Krishna didn't return, then Vishnu says we have no choice. Our only conclusion can be that Krishna was indifferent to the love of the gopis, and therefore the word supremi, with love, is false. Vishnu says, we can't tolerate this. No, we don't accept that. It's not true. When it says supremi, with love, it's true. Krishna had it, and so he gives some reconciliation. He says, even though Vasudeva and Devaki, they have prema and they can't be neglected, still, the residents of Vrindavan, headed by Nanda Maharaj, their love is far, far greater than the love of Vasudeva and Devaki. And so it would be so improper, so inappropriate to neglect them. How could he do that? So you may say then that Krishna's appearance, he has to kill the demons, he has to protect the devotees, he has to protect the residents of Mathura and later Dwarka, Paritanaya sadhanam and vinashaya chadushkritam and dharma samstarpana. He's got to speak that Bhagavad Gita. And he also has, this is a typical Hare Krishna explanation, he says it's for Leela Prabhu. It's just a pastime. Krishna has to do his pastimes in Dwarka. He has to kidnap Rukmini. That Parijata tree's got to be taken away from Indra. He's got to humiliate Indra. He's got to serve Yudhishthir. He's got to bow down to him and help him with his Rajasuya Yagya. And aside from that, Krishna also has to return to Vrindavan after seeing a Jnana Yagya. But he has all these other things to do. Vishnu says, don't think like this. He says, he gives an example which I've mentioned in several of our previous classes, but we want to fluff it out a little more today. He says that just as a person has some gold, and someone's wondering what is the value of the gold, what is the purity of the gold, you heat the gold to melt it, and by melting it you can see how pure it is. So in the same way, Krishna had this purpose. The words supremi, with love, are appropriate. Because with love, Krishna meant, he intended, I'm not going to come back very soon. Although he said, Ayesha, I'm going to return, and he did return, and we'll speak about that. The phrase supremi means that he's going to prove their love. With great love and great affection, Krishna is saying this thing. And indirectly also, this is Krishna fulfilling a previous statement that he made to the gopis when he said, Napareham niravadya samyujam, that I can't repay my debt to you. And he finishes that verse, which takes place right after the Ras Leela, long before Krishna left Vrindavan. Krishna told them that, Yapratiyatu sadhuna, let your own activities be your glory. And the gopis, they didn't think, what does he mean by that? But Krishna meant, I'm not going to return to Vrindavan. And by not returning, I'm going to reveal the purity of your love, just as someone melts gold, Vishwanath says. I'm going to melt your hearts in the fire of separation. And so at that time, Vishwanath says, when Nanda Maharaj was leaving, then Krishna expanded his Yogamaya potency. And along with Balaram, they came to Nanda Maharaj, and Vishwanath says such an amazing thing. He says that at that time, Krishna manifested two separate forms of himself, two separate forms of Balaram, and two separate forms of Nanda Maharaj, and two separate forms of the other devotees who were present there. It's an amazing thing. Huh? And at that time, by the potency of Yoga Maya, one Nanda Maharaj began to cry. And he went back to Vrindavan alone. While the other Nanda Maharaj, who was invisible to the previous Nanda Maharaj, he returned with Krishna to Vrindavan. One Krishna stayed in Mathura, and another Krishna returned with Nanda Maharaj. There were two Nanda Maharajas, and one Nanda Maharaj had all the cowherd boys and his younger brothers, and they were returning to Vrindavan alone, crying, and they kept turning back and looking and seeing Krishna and Balaram. And they were weeping, and Nanda Maharaj was beating his head and thinking, what am I going to say? How am I going to explain this to Yashoda? How will I explain this to the Vrindavan residents? What will I tell them? That Nanda Maharaj returned alone. But at the same time, invisible to that Nanda Maharaj, there was another Nanda Maharaj and another chariot with the same boys and his same younger brothers who returned with Krishna and Balaram. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in this explanation, he says, in this way, there are two compartments in Vrindavan. The compartment of union, where Krishna, Vrindavana Parityaga Padikam Nagachati, Krishna never takes even one step outside of that Vrindavan. He's always present there. But he says there's another chamber of Vrindavan, which is a chamber of separation. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he cites Rupa Goswami's Laghu Bhagavatamrita. Ascharjam ikadaikatra vartamananyapi dhruvam parasparam asamprikta sarupanyeva sarvata. He says that this verse, which speaks about how it's completely astonishing. Ascharya means it's astonishing that although there are two forms present in the same place, ekadat vartaman, these two forms, they were unaware of the other form, and they didn't contact it. It's amazing. So there's two forms, one form of Krishna in Mathura, one form of Krishna in Vrindavan, and they're unaware of the other form, and they didn't contact it. And moreover, two forms of Nanda Maharaj in Vrindavan. One form with Krishna, one form without Krishna. And they're unaware of the other form. And Rupa Goswami in Laghu Bhagavatamrita says they didn't contact each other. It's astonishing. He says, so these two different manifestations, the two different manifestations, not just of Krishna, but of his devotees, like Nanda Maharaj, he says they have two different purposes. And again, Vishwanath speaks about this example of melting gold to show its purity. So one of the purposes of these two chambers of Vrindavan is to show Uddhava the purity of the love of the gopis. And in this way, yapratiyatu sadhana, to repay his debt to the gopis by letting their own feelings be their glory, by revealing those feelings. By showing the Divyonmada, the divine madness of Radharani during the Brahmara Gita, when she's speaking to a bumblebee, when Uddhava comes to give his message. The Chitra Jalpa, the mad talks that Radharani exhibits. So Vishwanath says this purpose was there. That Krishna wanted to glorify the gopis. And Vishwanath goes on to say something very relevant for our topic, and this is why I wanted to focus some on this particular purport. Because our broader topic, we're supposed to be speaking about the meeting in Kurukshetra. Do you remember? We've been stuck for weeks on Krishna leaving Vrindavan, and then Krishna, what happened in Mathura, and then Krishna leaving, how Nanda Maharaj left Mathura and Krishna stayed behind. But Vishwanath says that these two different forms. One of these manifested forms of Krishna's devotees in separation, the chamber of Vrindavan in separation, it was those devotees who later went to Kurukshetra and showed themselves to Vasudeva, Devaki, and all the different queens who were there, all the members of the Yadu dynasty. And by doing that, we're looking ahead now at our discussion later on, a meeting in Kurukshetra. By those devotees who were expanded forms of Nanda Maharaj and Sunanda and the younger brothers of Nanda Maharaj and the cowherd boys who were present in Vrindavan in a separate chamber, and although they were present at the same time that their expansions are present there, they were unaware of each other. So it was those forms who were in the chamber of separation who went to Kurukshetra. And it was those devotees who gave the blessing to Rukmini and the other wives of Krishna and the members of the Yadu dynasty, that they could get prema. In the same way that Vasudeva didn't really, when Krishna came to see him and release him after killing Kamsa, Vasudeva just became stunned and he started offering prayers and saying, "You're not really our sons." And Krishna's kind of making a face himself. But Nanda Maharaj was there. And Jiva Goswami says that by the presence of Nanda Maharaj, by his association, then Vasudeva got this ecstatic love. So this is a very, very significant and important event. Krishna returned to Vrindavan with Nanda Maharaj. 2 chambers in Vrindavan. 2 separate groups of devotees. One, the chamber of union, the other chamber, the chamber of separation. And that chamber of separation, it was those devotees who went to Kurukshetra. And their purpose, it was Krishna's purpose in bringing them there, was to give this Braj Prem to the members of the Yadu dynasty. It was Krishna's purpose to make known the love of the residents in Vrindavan, and especially the gopis, that Krishna manifested this separate form of himself. And therefore, later we'll hear about Uddhava, when he speaks to Nanda and Yashoda. He uses the present tense. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is so amazing. He picks apart every little detail. They can see with the eyes of love, prati shloki, prati akshan, every verse, every syllable of the Srimad Bhagavatam. In the 46th chapter, the next chapter, text 35, Uddhava tells Nanda and Yashoda, Hatva kangsam ranga madhye pratipam sarva sattvatam yadaha va samagatya Krishna satyam karoti tat. That after killing Kamsa, Krishna's now definitely, he's going to return his promise to return to you. So he's using this in the present tense. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he gives some other evidence about these 2 chambers. He says that when Uddhava first entered into Vrindavan, he saw everybody was so happy and so ecstatic. And all the cows were mooing, and they were giving so much milk, and the calves were playing, and the bulls were fighting together. They like to do that. And everywhere was the sound of milking cows and the sound of the flute. Everybody was dancing and singing, and all the ladies of Vrindavan were churning makhan, butter, and they were singing the pastimes of Krishna. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that when the Bhagavatam speaks about this, that it indicates that Uddhava had entered the chamber of union. 2 chambers in Vrindavan. And Vishwanath gives this as some evidence to support this point, that there are 2 chambers, the chamber of union and the chamber of separation. This is a very important point we're going to build on in our discussion. This is still a foundational point. We have to build a palace on top of this foundational point. So stay with us on this point, how there are 2 chambers in Vrindavan, the chamber of union and the chamber of separation. And the evidence that he gives is that when Uddhava first entered Vrindavan, the Bhagavatam says that everything was so joyous. And he saw these wonderful auspicious signs. Vishwanath says that's because he was at that time in the chamber of union. But then he went a little further and he came to the chamber of separation. And everyone was crying and crying and crying. So we'll hear more about this. I want to, at this point, divert a little bit to a little-known book called Narottam Vilas by Narahari Chakravarti Thakur. And in there he gives us some other evidence to support this kind of conception about how there can be two compartments in the same place. Therein he speaks about the life of Narottam Das Thakur. And in one chapter, we wrote some article about this in our Krishna Katamrita Bindu magazine. I don't remember the chapter there in Narottam Vilas, but it speaks about Narottam's visit for the first time to Navadvip. And he was going there, and when he arrived, Narottam found that everyone was in ecstasy, and everywhere there was kirtan going on all over Navadvip. And it was the most amazing, wonderful place. And then he went a little further. And then suddenly, all the kirtans and all the joyous happiness in Navadvip disappeared. And he saw the whole place was empty and devoid of life. And then he saw one elderly man sitting underneath a tree and just crying and crying. Ha, Gauranga, ha, Gauranga. And Narottam went and offered his obeisances to that effulgent devotee who was crying and crying. And Narottam asked him, where is the house of Nimai Pandit? Where is Sachi Mata? And hearing his words, that devotee began to cry and cry. And with a choked voice, he told Narottam, he left us. He left us. Nimai left us. And then crying and crying, he took Narottam with him to the home of Sachi Mata. And Narottam Das Thakur had darshan of Sachi Mata, much in the same way that Uddhava had darshan of Mother Yashoda after Krishna had left Vrindavan. So these two things are there. I want to stop at this point. In our next session, we'll speak about what happened from primarily two different books, from Gopal Champu and from Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and a little bit from the Bhagavatam, about what happened when Nanda Maharaj returned to Vrindavan without Krishna. So at this point I want to ask the devotees if anybody has any reflections or comments or anything. This would be the time. Very, very deep topics. I hope everyone's been able to digest it. I want to thank Madhupati Prabhu and Sanjay Darvikar for taking part. Natalia, thank you for also for posting the link on our WhatsApp group in Brajabanita. Mahendra Prabhu, my pranams. And Usha's made some comment. Please, devotees, if you have some reflection or some questions or comments, please share this. She says, my pranams, I've heard that Krishna prefers the separation from his beloved so that he can see her intensely everywhere when compared to him staying close to her. This sounds like Krishna is concerned more about his feelings than those who miss him. Would you please shed some light on this? Well, in his Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Sanatana Goswami says something a little different to that. He says that Krishna, seeing that actually the Brijbasis get more ecstasy in his separation, seeing that the Brijbasis, they see him everywhere in their separation, to increase their ecstasy of love, and as we've heard today, to glorify their love, to shed a light on it, to reveal that love to the world, Krishna left. It's said that once at the place known as Prem Sarovar, near to Barsana, Krishna was sitting on the lap, Radharani was sitting on the lap of Krishna, And as a story many devotees know, a bumblebee came and was attracted by the lotus face of Radharani, thinking it to be a flower. Radharani became frightened, started waving her hands, go away, go away. The bee, seeing her lotus-like hands, became even more eager. Wow, there's some really nectar here. And then Radharani started crying, go away, go away. And then when the bee smelled the fragrance of Radharani's mouth, he became completely intoxicated. And then Madhu Mangal, who was there, he's a Priyanarma Saka, he's present sometimes with the divine couple, very bravely picked up a stick and said, go away. And he drove the bumblebee away. And then he turned and he very proudly said, Madhusudan is gone. Now, Madhusudan means a bumblebee. It's a famous story. This is a story of what's known as prema, when prema vaichitya, thank you. When the lover and the beloved are together, but they're feeling separation. And what happened at that time, when Radharani heard Krishna say, Madhusudan is gone, she thought, oh, Krishna's gone. How is he? And she's crying. She's sitting on the lap of Krishna, and she starts crying, feeling separation. And at that time, Krishna was looking at her, and he thought, the love of Radharani, the love of the gopis is so astonishing. We're together. She's sitting on my lap. Hello. And you're on my lap. But she's feeling more ecstasy. She's feeling separation from you when there's union. And in the same way, she feels union when there's separation. When I leave, then she feels union in her madness. So that union in separation, Krishna says, that's greater. That's more ecstatic. There's more ecstasy there than when Radharani's with us. So this is the statement, the description of our acharyas. Madhupati Prabhu has commented, what did Vasudeva and Devaki do in previous lives versus Nanda Maharaja and Yashoda to get Krishna and Balaram as their sons? Why the latter's love is so much more intense? Well, they were Prishni and Garba in their previous lives, Vasudeva and Devaki. And they performed Sutapa. They performed so many austerities to get Krishna and Balaram as their sons. But Nanda and Yashoda, they're the eternal parents of Krishna. And their love is spontaneous. They didn't do austerities like that. Sometimes there's some description given like that. But we don't find that very satisfying, that just by doing some austerities, someone can get the love like Nanda and Yashoda. Rather, we understand that this is their eternal sthayi bhav, this is their fixed love for Krishna. I hope that's satisfying. Hare Krishna, Mother Leela Avatar, thank you for blessing us with your association. I'm very humbled to see you here. She's commenting, these stories of Krishna are so amazing. And our dear God sister Jagat Ambika, dear friend from Los Angeles, I hope everything's okay for you. She's saying that may Krishna bless you, keep you inspiring and preaching. Thank you very much. We need the blessings of all the devotees. And Ujjwala Rasagya Mataji, nice to see you present here. Thank you for saying that Usha equals Ujjwala Rasagya, because I wouldn't know that. So I want to stop here. Again, if anybody has any other reflections, you can offer them. Anapayani Radha, do you have something you want to share with us today? What are you walking away with?
Thank you so much. I'm walking away with a blown mind. Because it's really amazing Katha, and I'm a little bit upset that I wasn't able to hear it attentively from the beginning. But the main thing, I was really impressed about this chambers in Vrindavan, 2 chambers in Vrindavan, how their separation and union and different forms of Nanda and other residents. And I have a question. You mentioned that you mentioned this verse that Krishna is telling gopis that may your own activities be your glory, and you said that it indicates that Krishna gonna leave Vrindavan, and I'm wondering how exactly it indicates this.
Well, that's my humble understanding, that indirectly that verse was foretelling Krishna's leaving Vrindavan. When he says pratyatu sadhuna, what does it mean? Let your own activities be your glory. Well, how is it glorious? Nobody knows anything about them. The word gopi comes from the same bij dhatu of gupta, which means hidden. And the gopis hide their love. And no one knows about the gopis. It wasn't until Krishna left Vrindavan that the gopis' love was revealed. And that this statement, pratiyatu sadhana, came to be true. Only when Uddhava went to Vrindavan and he saw the love of the gopis and everyone heard about it. Otherwise, the statement of Krishna had no meaning. But it was fulfilled with this. Do you have something else? Okay. Natalia's commented here. Only with their feelings of separation, the Brijbasis could induce prem in Vasudeva. I'm contemplating this. Yes, that this was another purpose of Krishna, that he wanted to open, as we'll speak later on, as I said, is a very foundational topic, these two chambers. Krishna wanted to open the school, the school of the love of Braj. He wanted to open the University of Braj Prem, as we sometimes say. And the first student was Uddhava, and then he opened in that separate branch later in Mathura. But the teachers of that university are the Brijbasis. Krishna can't do it himself. Only the devotees can give that ecstatic love. And especially the devotees who are experiencing that separation. They're the ones who are giving that. And therefore, Uddhava is seeing that ecstatic separation that the gopis and Nanda and Yashoda have. And he gets that love, seeing their separation. Seeing the separation that those devotees who were experiencing in Vrindavan and how they arrived in Kurukshetra. And how there in Kurukshetra, there was simultaneous union and separation. There was union because they were together, but there was separation because they knew that very soon Krishna's going to return to Dwarka. So understanding that and seeing that ecstatic love, those feelings were conveyed, they were transmitted to Vasudeva and Devaki there, and to Rukmini and the different queens and the members of the Yadu dynasty. And then we'll speak something more about a third University of Braj Prem in Jagannath Puri, and a fourth University of Braj Prem, which took place when Srila Prabhupada came to the West, and he started the same program, which is known as Ratha Yatra. So if you stay tuned for some of these topics in the future, we'll discuss more about this. Thank you all very much. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Samaveda Bhakta Binda ki jai, Vancha Kalpadharu